Alright, let's start. The Semmelweis reflex. In 1847, a young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis was watching women die, and he knew exactly why. The maternity ward at Vienna's first obstetrical clinic had a maternal death rate approaching 35% from childbed fever. The second clinic, staffed by midwives, sat at 4%. Semmelweis noticed the difference. He found the cause. Then the medical establishment spent 2 decades making sure no one listened to him. The state of medicine in the 1840s was one of confident ignorance. Germ theory did not yet exist. Disease was understood through the lens of miasma, bad air, imbalance of humors, the invisible weight of fate. Doctors moved directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands because no framework existed to explain why that would matter. The idea that a physician could be the vector of death was not just unfamiliar, it was professionally intolerable. Semmelweis made the connection in May of 1847 after his colleague Jakob Kolechka died from a scalpel wound sustained during an autopsy, exhibiting symptoms identical to childbed fever. He introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution. Within months, the death rate in his ward fell below 2%. The numbers were not ambiguous. They were reproducible, documented, and completely ignored. Prominent physicians including Karl Eduard von Siebold publicly dismissed his findings. The Vienna Medical Society turned away. The data spoke. The institution refused to hear it. What happened next reads like a case study in how establishments protect themselves from uncomfortable truths. Semmelweis grew increasingly desperate, writing open letters, confronting colleagues, watching women die from a preventable cause while holding the solution in his hand. In 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum. He died 14 days later from the same type of infection he had devoted his career to preventing, possibly from a beating by guards. He was 47 years old. It would take Pasteur's germ theory and Lister's antiseptic surgery before the medical world finally accepted what Semmelweis had proved with a bucket of lime water and a ledger of death rates. By then, tens of thousands of preventable deaths had accumulated. The cure existed. The proof existed. The only thing missing was the willingness of powerful men to accept that they had been the cause. The scurvy scandal. For 2 centuries, the British Navy possessed a documented, tested, and proven cure for the deadliest killer at sea. They lost it on purpose. Not through negligence or ignorance, but through bureaucratic inertia so profound it functioned as a kind of institutional amnesia, and sailors kept dying long after the answer was sitting in plain sight on a published page. Scurvy killed an estimated 2 million sailors between 1500 and 1800, more than all naval combat deaths across the same period combined. The working theory of the time held that long voyages caused disease through miasma, spoiled provisions, or simply the corrupting influence of the sea itself. The idea that the human body required a specific nutrient, and that citrus fruit contained it, sat completely outside the conceptual framework available to most naval physicians of the era. In 1601, Captain James Lancaster conducted what amounts to a controlled experiment across 4 ships. The crew given lemon juice stayed healthy, the others deteriorated. In 1747, naval surgeon James Lind ran a clinical trial aboard HMS Salisbury, comparing 6 treatments in 12 scurvy patients. Citrus worked within 6 days. He published his findings in 1753. The British Navy adopted lemon juice as standard issue in 1795, 2 years later. Tens of thousands of deaths filled that gap. Then, in the early 1800s, the Navy switched from Mediterranean lemons to cheaper West Indian limes, without realizing limes carry significantly less vitamin C. Scurvy crept back. The word limey, now a casual slur, is the direct linguistic inheritance of that cost-cutting substitution. The regression runs deeper than bad procurement. By the time Robert Falcon Scott reached Antarctica in 1912, the medical consensus had actually moved backward. Germ theory, a genuine triumph, had paradoxically convinced many physicians that scurvy was caused by tainted food rather than nutritional deficiency. A century of hard-won knowledge had been erased, not by suppression, but by a new paradigm sweeping out the old understanding along with the errors it corrected. If a cure for the leading cause of death at sea sat in a published document for 42 years before anyone acted on it, what cures are sitting in published documents right now? The scurvy scandal is not a story about a missing discovery. It is a story about what happens when the answer is already there and the institution simply cannot be moved. The lobotomy approval. In 1949, the Nobel Committee awarded its prize in physiology or medicine to a man who had spent a decade driving metal spikes through people's eye sockets and into their brains. His name was Antonio Egas Moniz. The patients whose skulls he had entered without surgical consent were still alive. Many of them would never be the same again. The committee called it a breakthrough. History would take longer to find the right word. The 1930s and 1940s were a period of genuine desperation in psychiatric medicine. Asylums were overcrowded. Effective treatments for psychosis, severe depression, or mania simply did not exist. Into that vacuum came the lobotomy, which Moniz developed in 1935, and which his American counterpart Walter Freeman refined into the transorbital procedure, a technique he performed by inserting a modified ice pick beneath the eyelid, tapping it through the orbital bone, and sweeping it through the frontal lobe. Freeman had no surgical training. He sometimes performed the procedure in his office. He once operated on 2 patients simultaneously. Freeman performed an estimated 3,500 lobotomies in his career. At the peak of the procedure's popularity in the early 1950s, approximately 5,000 operations were carried out annually across the United States alone. Patients as young as 12 received the treatment. Rosemary Kennedy, sister of the future president, underwent the procedure in 1941 at her father's authorization, without her mother's knowledge. She was left permanently incapacitated, institutionalized for the rest of her life. The procedure did not collapse because of ethical reconsideration. It collapsed because Thorazine, the first effective antipsychotic drug, became available in 1954. Within years, lobotomy rates fell towards 0. The pharmaceutical alternative was cheaper, repeatable, and required no ice pick. Freeman was ultimately barred from operating in 1967 after a patient died during her 3rd lobotomy. He drove a camper van he called the Lobotomobile across the United States, performing procedures with something closer to evangelical enthusiasm than medical caution. The Nobel Committee has never rescinded Moniz's prize. It remains one of the most contested awards in the history of that institution. The procedure was not stopped because someone proved it was wrong. It was stopped because a pill was cheaper. That distinction matters more than we want to admit. The thalidomide cover. In the late 1950s, a sleeping pill was marketed across 46 countries as so safe it was specifically recommended for pregnant women experiencing morning sickness. Its name was thalidomide. By the time the full picture emerged, more than 10,000 children had been born without limbs. The internal documents showing the company had known about dangerous side effects years earlier were not a rumor. They were evidence in a legal case. Thalidomide was developed by the West German company Chemie Grünenthal and sold from 1957 under the brand name Contergan. The post-war pharmaceutical market was expanding rapidly, regulatory frameworks were still being constructed, and the medical profession had enormous confidence in the safety testing being conducted by manufacturers themselves. When early reports of peripheral nerve damage in adult patients began appearing in clinical literature, internal Grünenthal communications show the information was tracked, discussed, and not disclosed to regulators or physicians. By 1961, the scale of the disaster was becoming impossible to conceal. Physicians in West Germany and Australia had independently connected a wave of infants born with phocomelia, the near absence of limbs, to maternal thalidomide use during the first trimester. The drug was withdrawn in West Germany in November of 1961. Approximately 10,000 to 20,000 children were affected worldwide. Roughly half did not survive infancy. In the United States, a single FDA medical officer named Frances Oldham Kelsey had repeatedly blocked thalidomide's approval, citing insufficient safety data, despite intense pressure from the American distributor. She received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from John F. Kennedy in 1962. One woman, one desk, and one refusal to be moved stood between an entire continent and the same catastrophe. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 passed directly in response to the thalidomide scandal, required pharmaceutical manufacturers to prove both safety and efficacy before approval, fundamentally reshaping drug regulation in the United States. Chemie Grünenthal did not issue a formal apology to survivors until 2012, 50 years after the crisis broke publicly. One woman in one office stood between an entire continent and a catastrophe that had already claimed 10,000 children everywhere else. How many catastrophes happened in the countries where no one like her was there to hold the line? The Radium Girls silenced bodies. In the 1920s, young women in American watch factories were painting clock dials with luminescent radium paint and being instructed to sharpen their brushes by putting them in their mouths. The technique was called lip dip point. Management told the workers the paint was harmless. The company's own scientists handled radium with lead shielding and long tongs. The women doing the actual painting were told to lick it. The United States Radium Corporation employed hundreds of young women in Orange, New Jersey, and Ottawa, Illinois from approximately 1917 onward. Radium paint produced a faint, magical glow, and the watch dials were in high demand, especially during wartime. The workers were largely immigrant women from working-class backgrounds, young, often enthusiastic about their relatively well-paid work. Some painted their teeth and fingernails with the paint for fun at night, because management had assured them it was completely safe. The company's medical consultant, a man named Frederick Flynn, examined sick workers and declared them healthy. He had been paid by the company. He held no medical degree. Radium is a bone seeker. Once ingested, it replaces calcium in the skeleton and cannot be expelled. The workers began experiencing radionecrosis of the jaw, spontaneous bone fractures, severe anemia, and tumors. Their bones were literally dissolving from the inside. 5 workers, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, and Catherine Schaub, filed suit in 1927. The company employed a strategy of delay, attempting to run out the statute of limitations while the women's health deteriorated in public view. The case was settled in 1928. Each plaintiff received $10,000 plus a modest annual stipend. Most were dead within years of the settlement. The legal and historical consequences were substantial. The Radium Girls case directly influenced the development of occupational disease labor law in the United States and established precedents that would later be applied to nuclear industry workers. Their suffering was not incidental to that progress, it was the mechanism of it. When researchers exhumed some of the women's remains for later analysis, the bones registered on Geiger counters decades after death. Their bodies had become the evidence. The company's own scientists wore lead aprons and used tongs to handle radium. The women doing the actual work were told to lick it. What that tells you about who the company believed was expendable is not subtle. The tobacco playbook. By 1953, the major American tobacco companies possessed internal research confirming that cigarettes caused cancer. What they did next was not panic, not disclosure, and not a quiet reformulation of their product. They held a meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and decided to manufacture doubt. What they built in that room became the template for how industries suppress inconvenient science, and it is still in active use today. The post-war American cigarette market was the most lucrative consumer product industry in the world. Roughly 45% of American adults smoked. The cultural status of cigarettes, woven into advertising, film, medicine, and social ritual, was essentially total. When independent researchers began publishing links between smoking and lung cancer in the early 1950s, the industry faced an existential threat. Its response was not to contest the science through legitimate counter-research. It was to contaminate the scientific environment itself. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee, created in December of 1953, was designed from inception to produce the appearance of ongoing scientific uncertainty. The industry hired credentialed researchers at premium salaries to generate contradictory findings, funded medical conferences, and cultivated relationships with scientific journals. An internal Brown and Williamson memo from 1969, never intended to be seen publicly, captured the strategy in a single sentence. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. The U.S. Surgeon General's report officially linking smoking to lung cancer did not appear until 1964, more than a decade after internal confirmation of the link. An estimated 100 million people died from tobacco-related illness in the 20th century. The deeper damage was structural. The same strategy was exported wholesale to industries facing inconvenient research findings of their own. The sugar industry paid Harvard researchers in the 1960s to redirect scientific blame for heart disease from sugar to dietary fat, a redirection that shaped global nutrition guidelines for decades. The asbestos, leaded gasoline, and fossil fuel industries adopted variations of the same playbook. The methodology was franchised. They did not just suppress the truth about cigarettes, they built a machine for suppressing truth, and then they sold the machine to anyone who needed it. The cholesterol reversal. For 50 years, the global medical establishment told 1 billion people that dietary fat caused heart disease, that cholesterol was the enemy, and that the science behind this advice was settled. The advice was built on data that had been selectively chosen. The correction, when it finally arrived, was buried in a footnote that most people never read. The foundational document of the dietary fat hypothesis was Ansel Keys' 7 countries study, published in 1970. Its conclusion, that saturated fat raised cholesterol and cholesterol caused heart disease, reshaped food policy, pharmaceutical development, and the contents of supermarket shelves across the Western world. What the study did not disclose was that Keys had originally collected data from 22 countries. He selected the 7 that supported his hypothesis. The data from France, West Germany, and other countries showing no such relationship was excluded. The methodology was not secret. It was contested by other researchers almost immediately. Those objections did not reach nutrition guidelines, hospital cafeterias, or the public. In 2016, researchers at the University of Minnesota rediscovered data from the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, a clinical trial conducted between 1968 and 1973. The trial had tested exactly the dietary fat hypothesis. It found that replacing saturated fat with vegetable oil lowered cholesterol but increased mortality, the opposite of the predicted outcome. The lead researcher, Ivan France, had chosen not to publish the results because, as his son later explained, they were disappointing. The buried data sat in a storage room for more than 40 years. That same year, a study published in JAMA Internal Medicine confirmed that the sugar industry had paid Harvard researchers in the 1960s to redirect the scientific blame for heart disease from sugar to fat, a transaction with direct consequences for half a century of dietary policy. The statin industry, built substantially on the cholesterol framework, generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually. In 2015, the U.S. dietary guidelines quietly removed the decades-old cap on dietary cholesterol, describing it as no longer a nutrient of concern, effectively reversing a foundational pillar of nutritional advice. The announcement received minimal public coverage. The dietary advice that shaped what a generation ate, how doctors treated their patients, and what industries were built was based on data its own creator knew was incomplete. And when the correction finally came, they changed a footnote. The antibiotic resistance warning. In 1945, the man who discovered penicillin stood at the Nobel Prize podium and warned the world in precise, specific language that misusing his discovery would breed bacteria that nothing could kill. He named the mechanism. He described the risk. He asked the world to be careful. It was the most prominent scientific stage on Earth, the clearest possible warning from the most credible possible source. And then we built an entire industry around ignoring him. Alexander Fleming's Nobel acceptance speech is not vague. He told the audience that a time would come when penicillin could be bought freely and that an ignorant person might easily underdose themselves, exposing their microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug and making them resistant. He was describing, in 1945, precisely the mechanism that would drive one of the most serious medical crises of the 21st century. Within years of his speech, hospital-acquired Staphylococcus aureus infections were already showing penicillin resistance. Methicillin was developed in 1959 specifically to counter this. MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, emerged in 1961. 2 years after the counter-drug existed, the bacteria had already defeated it. The agricultural dimension is where the scale becomes staggering. Beginning in the 1950s, the farming industry adopted antibiotics as livestock growth promoters. Between 70 and 80% of all antibiotics used in the United States today are consumed not by humans, but by animals being raised for food, a practice with a direct and documented link to resistance development in human pathogens. A 2022 Lancet study attributed 1.27 million deaths directly to antibiotic-resistant infections in 2019, with a further 4.95 million associated deaths. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical pipeline for new antibiotics has been effectively dry since the 1980s. Companies including GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca have exited antibiotic research entirely because a successful antibiotic is used briefly and sparingly, not taken daily for decades like a blood pressure medication. The business model does not reward saving lives in this particular way. The bacterium Fleming was studying when he made his original discovery was Staphylococcus aureus, the same organism now leading the antibiotic-resistant death toll. The thing that gave us the antibiotic era is now threatening to end it. A Nobel laureate warned us from the podium with precise language in 1945. If that was not enough to change the course of what followed, what warning would have been? The psychedelic shutdown. Between 1950 and 1965, researchers at Harvard, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins published more than 1,000 peer-reviewed clinical studies on psychedelic compounds, involving approximately 40,000 patients. The results were promising for the treatment of addiction, end-of-life anxiety, and depression in ways that existing medicine could not touch. Within a decade, every active study was shut down, every compound was criminalized, and 3 decades of potential medical progress vanished. Not because the science failed, because the politics shifted. The clinical environment of the 1950s and early 1960s was genuinely open to novel psychiatric research. Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof conducted more than 4,000 LSD-assisted therapy sessions between 1960 and 1967, documenting significant and sustained reductions in anxiety among terminal cancer patients in mainstream psychiatric journals. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, underwent LSD therapy in the late 1950s, believed the experience replicated the spiritual transformation that had ended his own drinking, and attempted to integrate it into AA's program. The AA board prevented him. Even at that early stage, the compounds were generating institutional discomfort that had nothing to do with their clinical profile. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed LSD and psilocybin in Schedule I, defined as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, despite the existing published clinical literature demonstrating medical use. Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, stated in a 2016 interview that the war on drugs was designed to disrupt the anti-war left and black communities, and that the administration knew it was not being honest with the public. The scheduling decisions were political. The clinical evidence was not consulted. Research that had been actively publishing for 15 years simply stopped, and the compounds entered a legal category that made further study nearly impossible for 3 decades. Research resumed cautiously in the 1990s and accelerated dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s. Current trials at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Imperial College London show psilocybin-assisted therapy producing remission rates in treatment-resistant depression that far exceed existing pharmaceutical options. In 2024, the FDA declined to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD despite Phase 3 trial results, a decision critics described as applying a different evidentiary standard than that routinely applied to conventional pharmaceuticals. We did not run out of evidence. We ran out of political permission. And the people who paid the price were the ones sitting in the waiting rooms of a medicine that had already learned how to help them. The germ theory delay. There is a single idea whose delay in acceptance killed more people than every war of the 19th century combined. Not a weapon, not a plague, not a natural disaster. An idea. The idea that invisible living things could enter the human body and cause it to fail. The evidence for this had been accumulating for decades. The scientists who held the proof were alive, published, and credentialed. What stopped the world from listening was the almost gravitational pull of what everyone already believed. The foundational evidence arrived in pieces across the 19th century. In 1835, Agostino Bassi linked a silkworm disease to a fungal parasite, the first demonstration that a living microorganism could cause disease in another living creature. In 1854, John Snow mapped 616 deaths from a London cholera outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, not to bad air or miasma, by plotting addresses against a map and finding a pattern too precise to be coincidence. He had the pump handle removed. The outbreak ended. The local Board of Health restored the pump handle after the outbreak subsided, attributing the improvement to natural causes, and returned to miasma as the official explanation. Louis Pasteur's swan neck flask experiment in 1859 disproved spontaneous generation, demonstrating that life did not arise from nothing in sterile conditions. Robert Koch isolated the anthrax bacillus in 1876 and the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, establishing the causal framework now known as Koch's postulates. The competing paradigm was not held by ignorant people. Miasma theory was the operating assumption of the most credentialed physicians in Europe. Max von Pettenkofer, one of the leading medical scientists of the era, drank a solution of cholera bacilli in 1892 to publicly disprove Koch's framework. He survived, possibly due to prior immunity, declared germ theory refuted, and his supporters cited the demonstration as evidence for years afterward. The failure to be killed was reframed as proof that the germ was not the cause. That move, the unfalsifiable defense of a dominant paradigm in the face of contradictory evidence, is not a historical curiosity. It is the mechanism behind almost every item on this list. Cholera killed an estimated 40 million people across 7 global pandemics in the 19th century. Tuberculosis killed at a scale that historians describe in the hundreds of millions across the same period. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms during the Crimean War dramatically reduced mortality through improved sanitation, even though she herself operated on a pre-germ theory framework attributing disease to atmospheric impurities. Her interventions worked because they incidentally addressed germ transmission. The evidence was visible in the outcomes before the theory existed to explain them. Every discovery on this list had to fight the same enemy, not ignorance, not malice, just the almost gravitational pull of what we thought we already knew. And the bodies of the people who died in that gap are the most expensive lesson in the history of science that we keep forgetting we have already learned. Look at what connects every item on this list. Semmelweis proved hand-washing saved lives with documented numbers and was committed to an asylum. Lind cured scurvy in 6 days and waited 42 years for a policy change. The Radium Girl's bones glowed on Geiger counters while a company doctor declared them healthy. Fleming warned from the Nobel podium, and we built an industry around ignoring him. The pattern is not about a lack of evidence. Every single one of these stories had evidence. The pattern is about what happens when a truth is inconvenient either to an institution, an industry, an economy, or an idea that people have staked their identity on. The suppression is almost never a single villain making a single decision. It is a structure, a set of incentives, a culture of comfortable consensus that treats the person holding the uncomfortable data as the problem to be managed. What you now carry, having watched this far, is not just a list of medical scandals. It is a framework for recognizing that structure when it appears in the present tense. Go to the comments and tell us which item made you the angriest and why. The most interesting argument wins nothing except the satisfaction of being right. Subscribe if you want more evidence that the story we were told is still missing chapters. The question is never whether the truth existed. It always did. The question is who needed it to stay quiet and for how long they succeeded.